Hi, I'm Ali Patterson, and welcome to Season 5 of the Fintech Show. Globally, we're seeing a lot of market consolidation taking place, coupled with many companies looking to be listed publicly. Various routes are being taken, such as IPO, direct listing, and in some cases via SPAC activity. Whatever the routes, VCs to advisories, CFOs to PE firms are having to really think about necessary due diligence to ensure a smooth merger or acquisition or even successful public listing. Companies once listed also face far more scrutiny from industry regulators and shareholders than they did before. Today, in this very special episode, we're going to look at why companies looking to be publicly listed or acquired need to ensure that their accounting and their reporting processes, particularly around revenue recognition and management, need to be absolutely watertight and why. Joining me on this episode is Mark Aubin from Aptitude, a company who are 100% dedicated to the finance office and are leading the way in the transformation and in the modernization of the now critical role that is the CFO. Speaking of CFOs, my co-host Leah Jacobiak went to interview Matt Briers, the CFO of Wise, formerly TransferWise, a company that is going through more changes than just its name. With an exciting direct listing being on the cards for a while now, his input has to be one of the hottest takes on going public in the UK. Not only that, we also have the one and only Lawrence Levy of Pixar and Apple fame, who navigated one of the biggest IPOs in history with Pixar, working super closely with Steve Jobs. He's going to lead off with underlining what the CFO's role can be outside of their typical remit. There's often a lot of confusion around CFOs and the role that they take outside of accounting. Well, what exactly is that role?
Absolutely, yeah. So, I have a particular take on this as well, but I would say as well that this take is sort of tailored for what I would call like innovation companies. So companies that are, and that could be big companies or small companies, it could be a tiny startup or a huge company. But if the goal of the company is innovation, excellence, dream building, the kind of stuff that Silicon Valley is famous for, but many companies all over the world, then I think the CFO in that kind of company has a very unique role. Because the startup companies or large companies that are trying to, have breakthrough innovation, they live on the precipice of two things. On the one side, there's the dream, the vision, the hope, the idealized. We're going to sort of make the world better. We're going to make better products in this space. It doesn't matter if you're making animated feature films. It doesn't matter if you're making the next great fintech breakthrough. It doesn't matter what it is, but you're trying to break through. To break through and innovate requires a lot of dream building and energy and inspiration and all that. And the other side, there's the practicalities of it, right? The practicalities, the fundraising, the profitability, the cash, right? Cash flow, cash is king, right? You can't run out of money. And so the CFO in those companies, in my mind, lives right on should live right on the edge of that precipice. It's an opportunity to be a person that is keeping one eye on both sides, right? One eye on the practicalities, the money, right? The stuff that we need, but also on the dream building. So this was huge. Pixar is a great example of this because obviously the creativity at Pixar, innovation at Pixar was everything, right? You're trying to make films that will entertain people the world over. And there are many things that can crush that creative spirit in that world. And as a CFO, I sort of learned that, wow, I have to push this company towards, a profitability, cash flow, all of those things without killing that spirit. And that required me to develop a great sensitivity to what it took to generate that spirit. An example of this would be, something like as simple as, how often are you going to make films? In Pixar's case, this was one of the biggest issues that we faced. When I joined Pixar, it was making Toy Story. It had 200 people working on it. It takes 4 to 5 years to make one film. 200 people make a film, right? Then they stop making the film, then they make another film. So every 4 or 5 years you get a film. Well, there's no way you can build a business releasing a film every 4 or 5 years. You've got to increase it. So we had this huge, months-long discussion. How often could Pixar make films? Would it be every 4 years, every 3 years, every 1.5 years? As the CFO, I'm like, you can't make them often enough. Twice a year, a summer release and a winter release. But quickly you come to see that if you push on that too hard, you'll dampen the creativity that's needed to make a great film. Because as I learned in that business, stories, I'm like, just make films quicker, instead of 5 years, let's do it in 3 years, let's optimize this. But I learned in that business that stories, they take time to percolate. They cannot be forced. You can't force creativity. There's a certain organic kind of life cycle to it. That was that particular business. So I had to be very sensitive to that and push the company to sort of do more, but not killing that. And that was a process. I believe that kind of process is where CFOs in innovative companies bring tremendous value. And the best ones are ones that are sensitive to both sides. And so that's why I think it's a great role and a really exciting role, that you don't have to be just always the numbers guy. No. Yes, you have to be sensitive and focus on the numbers, but also the strategic and creative side.
How has the role of the finance department and the CFO in particular changed over the last couple of years?
So the CFO office has always been traditionally focused on two areas. You have compliance and stewardship of the business. That's everything that has to do with cash flows of the business, accounting, regulatory reporting, disclosures. And then you also have the financial planning analysis, or the FP&A side of the business. So those have always been under the stewardship or guidance of the CFO office. What I think we're starting to see is the blending of those two areas. There's that one side of the camp that's how did the company do in the last trailing period, the last trailing quarter, and those actuals of the business activity. And then they start immediately looking at what is the future of the business. So getting the forecasting, budgeting, and planning, and so forth. So I think the big change is the connection between those two. It was kind of more of a handshake traditionally. Now it's becoming an interactive activity between the past and the future to be able to make sure the company is making strategic decisions based on what's going on in the company today and where it might go tomorrow.
Can a CFO now play a forward-thinking role within an organization?
Absolutely. So they already had a seat at the table for strategic decisions, but now they're often the enabler of those decisions as they had the best view of the company health. So rather than just saying, yes, we have cash on the books to make this acquisition or open a new market or go after a new business model, oftentimes they're enabler. They should now be presenting opportunities of where the company can make more strategic decisions and input. So I feel that they've always been at the table, but rather than it being in a reactive mode, answering the CEO's questions or the board's questions on a new business idea or business plan, the CFO is now in a more proactive mode to present opportunities back to the board, the CEO, the investors of the organization, and say, this is where we can go as a company. So having those real-time data insights that they have under their control and their systems and processes are things that they can now have in their back pocket and refer to quickly to enable those types of movements within an organization.
And looking at the bigger picture now, you've already mentioned, for example, you started with a team of 4, now you're hundreds. Looking at your role as a CFO, how has it evolved since you started in 2015, thanks to the growth of Wise, but also just the growth of the fintech industry in general?
Things need to be done whether you're a team of 1 or a team of 100. Someone needs their salaries paid. Can't have things going wrong. We're still doing our accounts, and the ship needs navigating. That's not changed in the last 6 years, and it won't change. But it's just got more complex in some ways. So, our business is way more complex today than it was 5 or 6 years ago. So navigating is on the one hand, needs to be done really at a granular level, But actually then just looking at this bigger picture is a very different story to what it was 6 years ago. So we've got a really good team doing that, and I rely on them, and they're much better at doing that than I ever would be. We're regulated now. Instead of really when we started just in one country, we're now regulated in, I think, 15 or 16 countries around the world and 48 different states, 49 states, I think, in the US. This all takes management, and as much as we'd love to do things at scale and centrally, actually, this takes people on the ground working with these regulators. And we have a great team in, whether it's in Singapore, in the US, in Latin America. So the team's actually starting to get more distributed. People I've not met yet, in the last year and a half. So on the one hand, like, it's the same things you're trying to do, but actually it's just got more complex. So you're constantly trying to simplify things and standardize things, but actually the nature of our business means that because we have regulators doing things slightly differently in every country, you end up localizing, and that just gets hard. And the only way to solve that is by hiring good people who can look after the bit on the right and the bit on the left.
Of course, in a business, the CEO is often thought of as the visionary. To what extent is the CFO also a visionary, and how important is it to have that forward-thinking ability when you're a CFO?
Yeah, so I think any leader has to be forward-looking. Like really the way I think about leadership is you've got to be able to look forward and look around the corner, and then work out how to explain that to a bunch of people and get them to have that context and then do smart things and move in that direction. Once you've kind of looked ahead, been able to have this kind of vision, whether it's vision or insight as to the challenges that are coming in the context, and hired the right people, there's not much else you can do as a leader. So I think purely you're forward looking. Yes, you can learn from the past, but I think CFOs are seen increasingly as this visionary or kind of highly strategic role. I would counter that. It's easy for me to sit here and say, of course, this is where CFOs' roles are going. But I think this is partly an optic, which might be a little contrarian to how people are thinking. And I'm not picking up the world of CFOs here. I think increasingly, in particular in tech, where like the Larry Pages of the world at Google don't spend a lot of time with the investor community, it gets left to the CFO, the Pichettes of the world. So they explain the vision to the street, and they explain the vision to the investor base. So and they do a great job at it. So they're naturally seen as visionaries. But actually, I do I spend a lot of time explaining this vision and explaining it in a way to investors and also the media in a way that is understand and hopefully interesting and exciting.
I want to talk with you a little bit about Silicon Valley funding and IPOs. For a lot of tech firms, it's all about going public and that's it. What is your take on exit strategies and IPOs?
Well, I've always seen and still see the IPO as a beginning, not an end, especially if you're a CFO. Because life changes once you're public. All of a sudden, it's just you and your little family and your little, group of people. But, once you're a public company, your accountability goes up, enormously. And, I always say, like, the people that are investing in an IPO, they're investing so that that investment goes up. For those people, for those investors, it's day one. And in a way, as management, you're working to some degree on their behalf. So if it's day one for them, it's day one for you. And so, I always take the attitude that, an IPO is an exit strategy for those who are liquidating stock that they've held in a company, but for management, and especially the CFOs and their teams, IPO is kind of a beginning more than an end. That's how I've seen it.
What are the common key challenges for a finance team in an era of pre-IPO, pre-direct listing, or even a company looking for an acquisition exit strategy?
There are many. You've got process, you've got data, you've got systems. reporting, both management, regulatory, and scalability of the business. Those are all challenges a company needs to be focused on, whether they're heading towards an IPO, whether it's a tech acquisition, whether they're looking to an acquisition. All those things have to be in place. The reason why I mentioned scalability is, any company that's going into pre-IPO or into some kind of strategic movement like that, they're looking to scale. So if a company's trying to get that access to that kind of capital, it's because there's some strategic actions behind it. You got to make sure the back end of your organization is going to be nimble enough to capitalize on those opportunities. So that's why I mentioned scalability. But one of the challenges that I really want to drill into is the data portion of that. Do you have access to your data? When you become a public company, you're going to be scrutinized from your investors, from your board, from your own employees, from the SEC, from all the regulatory bodies, and even analyst calls. One thing we do at Aptitude that we take pride in is we actually listen to the earnings calls of our public companies, because we want to see what are those KPIs, what are they reporting back to the investors and the investor community on how the company health is doing. So they always sprinkle in some key performance indicators on how they're doing. And it's always interesting to hear the analysts, the investor analysts, ask questions on the fly and see how quickly the CEO and CFO are prepared those answers. Because if they are prepared and they're giving good answers on the fly to those, it means they have good access to data to support questions on the fly. So that's the biggest thing, is how is their accessibility to data, and how can they use their data in a way to decide how the company's doing and respond productively to questions like that.
Why was it the right choice for Wise to go for the listing in London?
And we had 3 questions we had to answer when we listed. First was when might we do this? The second question was, where might we do this? And then the next question was, how? How are you going to do this? So the question you've asked really is where would we do this? But you can't really answer that question without looking at all 3 of those. So the question of when we would do this was we knew at some point we'd become a public company. And we've done, people, listeners, readers, you might have seen that we've done a bunch of fundraising over the years. Until 2017, that was for raising capital for our business. But after that, we were raising what's called secondary capital, secondary funds, which means some of our investors were selling, such that some new investors could come on board. And also some of our employees and some of our early investors would sell. And we were doing these secondary rounds. They were $300 million each of them. We did 3 of them. But they actually become quite a lot of work. And actually, as the valuation of the company goes up, and actually, after 10 years, it's only fair that some of our early investors want to get a return. That's the business they're in. These rounds start to get quite big. So doing them privately off the side of my desk starts to become a big job. And then you realize you've got these stock exchanges, which are kind of designed for this problem. So we realized actually now's about the right time where the business is ready, and we're why not do it now to become public? So then the question is, where do you do this thing? And the choice of where was, we're based in London, but actually, we have, if you look at our financials, we have a really healthy customer base in the US, in Europe, Asia Pacific, so we have a lot of choices. So really we looked at where these locations around the world. And we think of it really as, just like we think about our products, what's going to help or at least hinder the company. And the way you think about a stock exchange is it's not the exchange itself that is the market, it's rather an entry point to the world's financial markets. So you can enter through London, you could enter through New York, you could enter through Amsterdam. And when you looked at London, we thought, it's actually very convenient for us. We're based here. People around us know the stock exchange well. It's convenient. It's less onerous in some ways than New York. The level of reporting, etc. And so we thought, this is going to work for Wise. And actually, the world's best investors are going to come to London. So that made logical sense for us. And also, as a Brit, I'm pretty proud and happy to be doing it here as well. And then the third question was actually, how are you going to do this? Which I'm sure you'd ask around, a direct listing. And actually London's quite important for that, because the direct listing hasn't been done in London as we did it, but it's absolutely possible. So we felt that a direct listing was quite important to us, but London was totally ripe and ready for it, even though it had never done it before. So,
what should the key stakeholders care about when it comes to revenue management and how can it impact the route to being listed?
So revenue management and traditionally revenue recognition in general is a key requirement. You have to be compliant when you're heading towards your IPO, because you have to be compliant on day one of the IPO. You have to be 606 compliant or IFRS 15 compliant. Now, common sense would say that's not something you want to figure out when you're going IPOs. There's a lot of activity leading up to that. Now, naturally, the guidance deadlines did apply to private companies too. So most private companies heading up to IPO have to be compliant already. So they should be in a good state for that. But whether it be revenue management, revenue recognition, that's the one, I don't want to call it the magic bullet, but that's the one that you probably hear more in the press. There have been so many revenue recognition issues with currently public companies, but as well as companies that were headed towards IPO and had to delay their listing because SEC, under their scrutiny of looking at their financials, say, the way you're reporting this revenue doesn't add up, or it's something different. And so that can actually cause delays to your listing process if you don't have those things figured out well in advance. So anyway, just short answer to the question, back to the question of revenue management. There's so many reports of companies that either are facing delisting or scrutiny after they went public that could lead to shareholder lawsuits, to ultimately, if they're just not prepared for the IPO and SEC has a lot of questions about how they're accounting for revenue, that could delay their access to sorely needed capital. And it's more than just an IPO or anything in the public markets, just trying to get investment from a venture capital or any kind of funding group. You've got to have compliant financials. So revenue management is probably the poster child for companies getting into trouble if they're not prepared from a data process systems and data accessibility perspective before, well in advance of moving towards that strategic event.
After joining Pixar in the early 90s, was this decision to IPO within the first few years a decision that was made from the absolute get-go?
After I got into Pixar, when I saw that things were much worse than I imagined, I realized that IPOing it was going to be close to impossible. Because the business risk, every element of Pixar's financial sort of makeup was anathema to what public investors look for. And so, public investors, they like straight lines. They just like, predictability. They like curves that go up and to the right. They don't like bumps along those curves. The animated feature film business is the opposite. It's hit driven, revenue. You have a good year, then it goes like this, it goes like that. It's extremely risky. One miss on a film could stifle your revenues and profits for years. And I realized that this was going to be investors were not going to take to this easily. And I as a CFO, I went to talk to, at the time, he was my former boss as a lawyer, Larry Sonsini from the Wilson Sonsini firm. It was still is, the number one firm in Silicon Valley for doing IPOs and that kind of stuff. And I knew him well. And I remember I went to him and said, no, they're just not going to buy this. I said, people are not going to buy this story because the financial story is so difficult to explain. And he knew me well. And, he said, look, regardless of Steve's enthusiasm, he also knew Steve well. He said, you just got to disclose it. You just got to be, just put it out there the way it is, and you'll see. If people take it, they will, and if they don't, they don't. So there's Steve. He's going out saying, we're building the next Disney company, which is fine. You've got to show the vision and the dream and all that. And then there's me coming, yep, we're building the next Disney company, but this is the reality of the financials of that. And as the book showed, as you know, it was a very rough ride to get Pixar Finance through the public markets. We did pull it off, and it was the thing that enabled Pixar to flourish and succeed. But a lot of those disclosures did scare people away.
Well, that's all we've got time for on today's episode of the Fintech Show. I hope you've enjoyed hearing about the process of going public from people right at the heart of this journey. From Mark, who helps organizations get it right, to Lawrence, who embarked on one of the most famous IPOs in history, and to Matt, who has just navigated a direct listing in one of the most regulated industries in the world. It's such a glamorous and an iconic part of business, and one that can prove costly if it goes wrong. Congratulations, Wise, for such a fantastic direct listing, and thank you to you, the viewer at home. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.